The stage was set for another exciting night on The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. The studio was buzzing with energy. The bright lights, the cheers from the audience, and the hum of anticipation all mixed together into a perfect storm of excitement. Jimmy Fallon, the host with his usual charm and wit, stood at the center of it all, ready to kick off another unforgettable evening. As the band played the iconic opening tune, the audience clapped and cheered. There was always a certain magic in the air when the show began, but tonight felt just a little different. It wasn't that Jimmy didn't get excited about his guests, he absolutely did, but tonight was special. He had one of Hollywood's most beloved stars scheduled to join him, Keanu Reeves. Everyone knew him as the calm and humble action hero who had captivated audiences for decades, but in recent years, he had become more of a legend than just a movie star. Keanu's down-to-earth attitude, kindness, and sincerity had earned him the admiration of millions. And Jimmy, being a fan himself, couldn't help but feel a little extra thrilled. The lights above dimmed just slightly, signaling the start of the show. Jimmy took his usual spot behind the desk, his energy high but his face relaxed, ready for whatever came next. He smiled at the audience, making eye contact with as many people as he could. They were all there to have a good time, and Jimmy was determined to give them just that. Welcome everyone to The Tonight Show. We've got a great show lined up tonight, and I'm sure you're all excited to see our next guest, Jimmy said with a grin, his voice projecting the familiar warmth and enthusiasm. He paused, letting the excitement build. He's the guy you've seen in everything from The Matrix to John Wick, and if you've ever met him in person, you know he's the most down-to-earth guy on the planet. Please welcome the one and only Keanu Reeves. The audience erupted in applause as Keanu walked out onto the stage. His presence was calm, but it had a quiet strength that immediately put everyone at ease. He gave a small wave, a soft, humble smile lighting up his face as he shook Jimmy's hand. The audience cheered even louder, their admiration for him obvious. Keanu, welcome to the show, Jimmy said, his voice full of genuine excitement. It's great to have you here. Thanks for having me, Jimmy, Keanu replied in his usual understated way, his voice calm and measured. There was no ego in his words, just a sense of quiet gratitude. Jimmy, who was known for his light-hearted approach to interviews, started with one of his usual jokes. So you've been a part of some of the most iconic films of all time, right? I mean, The Matrix, John Wick, and Speed, all classics. But I have to ask, what's it like being the person who can literally stop bullets? Keanu chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling with a hint of humor. Well, it's not as glamorous as it seems, he said with a slight shrug. You know, it's just acting, really. It's all pretend. But I appreciate the love, of course. The crowd laughed along with him. Keanu's humility had always been one of the reasons he was so beloved by fans. It wasn't just his on-screen presence that made him stand out. It was the way he carried himself off-screen. He didn't buy into the Hollywood hype. Instead, he had always stayed true to himself. Jimmy continued with the interview, asking more light-hearted questions, trying to get Keanu to open up with some funny stories. The conversation flowed easily, with Keanu being as calm and grounded as ever. It was one of those moments where the audience could see that the man in front of them wasn't just an actor. He was someone who truly believed in the simple things in life, like kindness and living with integrity. After a few minutes of light banter, Jimmy could sense that the audience was enjoying the vibe. Keanu wasn't the type to give long, dramatic answers, but he was thoughtful in his responses, and that made the conversation feel more genuine. So, Keanu, Jimmy said, leaning forward slightly with a more serious expression, I have to ask, you've had such a long and successful career. I mean, you've been in this business for decades now. What's kept you grounded? A lot of people in your position would have changed, but you've stayed the same. How do you do it? The question was different from the usual, and it felt more personal. Jimmy wasn't just asking about a movie or a role. He was asking about Keanu, the person. The audience sensed it, too. There was a small shift in the atmosphere, a moment of quiet curiosity. Keanu didn't rush his answer. Instead, he took a brief pause, as if carefully choosing his words. Well, I guess I've always tried to stay connected to what matters, he said, his tone soft but serious. I've had some amazing opportunities, sure, but I've also had to face my own challenges. And through it all, I've learned that the most important thing is to treat people with kindness. It's easy to get caught up in the fame and the attention, but in the end, It's the relationships we build and the way we treat others that really counts. Jimmy nodded slowly, clearly moved by the sincerity in Keanu's words. The audience, too, seemed to absorb the weight of his statement. It wasn't just an answer to a question. It felt like a moment of real truth being shared. Keanu's words hung in the air for a moment, and Jimmy, always quick to lighten the mood, cracked a smile. You know, Keanu, you should give life advice more often. You're practically a philosopher at this point. The audience chuckled, but there was a sense of respect in the laughter. Keanu didn't seem to mind the joke. In fact, he smiled, acknowledging the playful comment but not losing the depth of the conversation. You know, Jimmy, Keanu said after a moment, it's really all about the small things. We can get so caught up in the big stuff, but it's the little things that make the difference. The way you treat people, the way you show up for others, the way you give back. Jimmy looked at him with genuine admiration. I think we could all use a little more of that, Keanu, he said, his voice almost reflective. I mean, you're right. Sometimes we get caught up in our own little bubbles, forgetting what really matters. As the conversation continued, Jimmy felt a shift in the air. There was something more profound happening here than just another interview. Keanu wasn't just talking about movies or his career. He was speaking about something that connected to the very heart of life itself: kindness, connection, and being true to oneself. For a moment, the energy of the show slowed down, and the audience, usually on edge for the next laugh or funny comment, seemed to be soaking in the truth that Keanu was offering. It wasn't what they expected. But then again, with Keanu Reeves, maybe that was exactly the point. The mood was set, the tone was clear, and Jimmy Fallon, the host who was always quick with a joke, found himself deeply moved by the unexpected wisdom of his guest. The night had barely begun, but already it felt different. As the conversation continued, the tone of the show had shifted. The usual banter between Jimmy and his guests was still there, but there was a deeper, more thoughtful layer to this interview. Jimmy, who had seen countless guests come and go, found himself in a rare moment of reflection. Keanu's words had stuck with him, and it wasn't just Jimmy who was feeling this shift. The audience, too, seemed quieter than usual, as if they were all taking in the simple yet profound truth that Keanu had shared. The loud claps and cheers had softened. People were listening. Keanu's thoughts about kindness and staying grounded had made a real impact. It wasn't the kind of answer one would expect on a late-night talk show, especially when the host and guest were usually joking around and making fun of each other, but tonight felt different. Keanu's sincerity was like a breath of fresh air in a world that sometimes felt too focused on superficial things. Jimmy decided to steer the conversation back to something more lighthearted, though he couldn't shake the feeling of gratitude that had settled over him. You know, Keanu, I have to admit, when I was preparing for tonight, I thought we'd be talking about all your big movies, the stunts, the fight scenes. But you've got me thinking about life in a whole new way. Keanu smiled, his eyes never leaving Jimmy's. It's funny, you know. People often think of me as this action guy, the one who's always in intense scenes or fighting bad guys. But the real work, the real challenge isn't in the movies. It's in how you treat the people around you. There was that quiet wisdom again, and Jimmy, still processing the shift, nodded in agreement. I think you just changed the way I'm going to approach my interviews from now on. Maybe I'll start asking all my guests what they think is the most important thing in life. You're onto something here. The audience chuckled at Jimmy's comment, but this time it wasn't just the usual laughter. There was an air of appreciation that followed. Keanu's influence was clear. He wasn't just an actor anymore. He was a person who had clearly thought deeply about his life and the world around him. But Jimmy wasn't done yet. He had one more question he was dying to ask. Okay, so you've told us about kindness, staying grounded, and being true to yourself. But what's the secret, Keanu? You've been in the public eye for decades. You've seen it all, the highs, the lows, the crazy roller coaster of fame. How do you stay so, well, you? Keanu paused for a moment, looking thoughtful. His eyes seemed to wander as if he were searching for the right words. I think it's about remembering that we're all human. It's easy to get caught up in the idea that fame is everything, or that being in the spotlight means you're more important than anyone else. But when you remember that we're all just people, trying to figure things out, it helps you stay grounded. There was a softness in his voice, a sincerity that made the audience feel like they were being led into something private, something real. Keanu wasn't offering a flashy answer. nor was he giving the expected success speech that many other actors might. Instead, he was giving them a piece of himself. "You know," Jimmy said, leaning back in his chair, "I've interviewed a lot of people, but not many have made me feel like this. You've made me think about things I haven't in a long time." Keanu's smile was gentle. "That's all I can ask for, just to share something real with someone." The crowd responded with applause, but it was quieter this time, more subdued. It wasn't just because they were in awe of Keanu. It was because they could feel the authenticity of the moment. It wasn't about entertaining them with flashy stories or trying to impress them with a big reveal. Keanu had given them something more valuable, a reminder of what really matters. Jimmy, always quick to bring the conversation back to a lighter note, decided to dive into something a bit more fun. All right. Enough deep thoughts for a second. Let's talk about John Wick for a moment. I mean, that franchise is insane. I've seen the movies and I have to ask, how do you prepare for those fight scenes? I imagine you have to be in incredible shape, right? Keanu laughed, the shift in energy bringing a sense of relief to the room. Well, yeah, it's a lot of training. But honestly, it's about more than just being physically prepared. It's about mental focus. You have to be able to block everything else out and just focus on the moment. When I'm doing a scene, it's not about how fast I can throw a punch or how many stunts I can pull off. It's about being in the moment and bringing that character to life in the most honest way I can. The audience perked up again, the excitement of hearing about one of his most famous roles bringing them back to their familiar state of excitement. Jimmy's eyes widened. That's so cool. I think I would be a mess if I had to do half the stunts you do in those movies. It seems like you have to be completely locked in, especially with all the choreography. Keanu nodded. Absolutely. It's a lot of work, but it's also a lot of fun. I think in a way it's kind of like life. Sometimes it's about focusing on what's in front of you, blocking out the noise and just giving it your all. Whether it's in a movie or in your personal life, being present is key. Jimmy leaned forward again, clearly enjoying this more personal side of his guest. I think I'm starting to see a theme here, he joked. Kindness, being grounded, focusing on the present. Keanu, you've got a whole philosophy going on here. Keanu grinned, the warmth in his expression contagious. Maybe, but I don't think it's anything too special. I think it's just about trying to be a good person and not losing sight of what's important. Jimmy, still smiling, let the thought linger for a moment before turning back to his audience. Well, if everyone in Hollywood had a mindset like Keanu's, I think we'd be living in a very different world. That's for sure. The crowd erupted in applause once again, but this time it wasn't just for the laugh. It was a genuine moment of agreement. Keanu had given them a lot to think about in such a short period of time, and Jimmy, always the host, knew that this moment was special. It wasn't just about the jokes or the questions. It was about the exchange of ideas, the reminder that there was more to life than the chaos of fame, and the importance of staying true to yourself. As the segment came to a close, Jimmy smiled, clearly grateful for the time spent with his guest. Keanu, I have to say, this has been one of the most memorable interviews I've ever done. Thank you for sharing so much with us tonight. Keanu nodded with a simple, genuine smile. Thank you, Jimmy. It's been a pleasure. The lights dimmed and the show moved on to the next segment, but the mood in the studio had shifted. The audience, still buzzing from the conversation, carried with them the message that Keanu had quietly shared about kindness, authenticity, and the importance of being present. For Jimmy, the show had taken on a new meaning that night. It wasn't just about entertainment anymore. It was about leaving people with something real, something they could take with them long after the lights went out. The night had already taken a surprising turn, and the energy in the studio was still buzzing with a quieter, more reflective vibe. The usual chaos of a late-night talk show had given way to something more genuine, something deeper. It was clear that the conversation had struck a chord with everyone, from the crew to the audience. But, as much as Jimmy wanted to keep the show moving and dive into the usual fast-paced fun, he found himself wanting to stay in this moment just a little longer. It wasn't often that an interview took on this kind of significance. Keanu sat beside him, calm as ever, seemingly unaffected by the attention. But there was something different about him tonight. He wasn't just a movie star or an action hero. He was someone who had, in his own quiet way, tapped into a truth that most people were too busy to notice. Kindness, humility, presence. These were the values he spoke of. And they were starting to resonate deeply, not just with Jimmy, but with the audience too. Jimmy cleared his throat, trying to find his usual rhythm again. He knew he had to keep the show moving, but part of him didn't want this moment to end. He'd had plenty of guests, but not many who left him feeling like this. It was almost as if Keanu had flipped a switch, helping everyone realize that there was more to life than just the glitz and glamour of Hollywood. So, Keanu, Jimmy began, his voice a little quieter now, you've talked a lot about kindness and staying grounded. But I have to ask, how do you actually practice that in a world that sometimes feels so chaotic? I mean, you're living in the spotlight, constantly in the public eye. How do you make sure you don't lose sight of what really matters? Keanu smiled. The kind of smile that made you feel like he genuinely appreciated the question. It wasn't just a polite smile. It was the smile of someone who had thought about these things deeply, someone who didn't take the superficialities of fame too seriously. That's a good question, Keanu said, his voice soft but steady. I think for me it's about finding balance. I know that the world can get loud, and the noise can drown out the important things. But it's in the small everyday actions where you find the truth. It's the simple things, like taking the time to listen to someone or holding the door for a stranger, or just being present when you're with people. Jimmy nodded thoughtfully, absorbing the weight of Keanu's words. The crowd had grown unusually quiet, hanging on every word that Keanu spoke. It was as if they too were learning something from this conversation, something that went beyond the typical entertainment they were used to. You know, Keanu, Jimmy said after a moment, I've got to say you make it sound so easy. But I think a lot of us struggle with that. We get so caught up in our own stuff, our own lives. It's easy to forget about the little things. I mean, I get so focused on getting the next big laugh or making sure I don't mess up the script that sometimes I forget to just be. Keanu tilted his head slightly, considering Jimmy's words. Yeah, I get that. It's easy to lose track of what's important when the world is moving so fast. But the trick is to slow down. When you're always chasing something, you miss what's right in front of you. Jimmy looked at him almost as if seeing him for the first time. He had heard similar advice before, of course. People often said things like, stop and smell the roses or live in the moment. But somehow hearing it from Keanu made it feel more real. More possible. It's funny, isn't it? Jimmy said, leaning back slightly in his chair. We're all chasing something. Whether it's success, approval, or just the next big thing, we're all running after it. But what if we didn't have to chase? What if we could just be happy with what we have? Keanu nodded again, his expression thoughtful. That's the thing. People always think they need more. More money, more fame, more recognition. But when you stop and think about it, the most important things are the ones you can't measure. The relationships, the moments, the kindness you share. For a moment, the room was completely still. There were no interruptions, no quick jokes, no applause. It was as if everyone in the studio had taken a collective breath and allowed Keanu's words to sink in. Even the crew, who were usually rushing around to make sure everything was running smoothly, seemed to slow down for a brief second. Jimmy shifted in his chair, now more reflective than ever. Keanu, you've got me thinking. You're absolutely right. All the things I've been working so hard for, success, fame, what good is it if I'm not present for the people who matter? If I'm not showing up for the people who care about me? Exactly, Keanu said, his voice steady. It's about showing up. It's about making sure that when you're with someone, they know you're there. Not just physically, but mentally and emotionally, too. We live in a world where it's easy to be distracted, to be somewhere but not really there. But when you make that choice to really show up, it changes everything. Jimmy looked at Keanu with newfound respect. He'd always admired him as an actor, but now he saw him in a different light. This wasn't just the guy who played cool action heroes on screen. This was someone who had clearly thought about life in ways most people never did. Someone who had found the secret to peace in a chaotic world. You know, Keanu, Jimmy said slowly, you've got a way of making everything sound so simple, like the answers are right there in front of us, but we just don't see them. Keanu shrugged, a small, humble gesture. I think it's simple because it is. We complicate things by overthinking them. Sometimes the answer is just to slow down and be kind, to take a moment and appreciate the people around you. Jimmy nodded again, his mind racing with the weight of the conversation. For once, he wasn't worried about the clock ticking down. or whether they had enough time for the next segment. He was fully immersed in the moment. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like the show wasn't about delivering the next joke or getting the next laugh. It was about something more real, something more human. The audience, too, seemed to feel it. They were quiet, paying attention, letting Keanu's words wash over them. Jimmy's next question came almost instinctively, without any of his usual comedic timing. Keanu, with everything you've gone through in your life, the ups and downs, how do you find the strength to keep going? I mean, you've had some really tough times, but you're still here, still doing what you love. Keanu's eyes softened at the question. I think it's about understanding that pain is part of life. We all go through tough times. It's how we respond to them that matters. You don't have to go through things alone, and you don't have to let the tough times define you. The studio was silent again. It wasn't uncomfortable silence, though. It was the kind of silence that came when something profound was said, and everyone needed a moment to let it sink in. I think you're right, Jimmy said quietly. I think it's about how you respond. Life's not always going to be easy, but it's about what you take from it, what you choose to do with it. Keanu smiled gently. Exactly. And I think the more we focus on the good, the more good we find. Jimmy sat back, taking a deep breath, his mind still processing everything Keanu had shared. He was used to interviews, used to the rhythm of the show, but this was different. This was a conversation about life, not just about a movie or a role. Well, Keanu, I don't know if I'll ever look at life the same way again after tonight, Jimmy said, his voice light, but there was a sincerity to it. You've given us all a lot to think about. Keanu gave a small, knowing smile. I'm glad. And with that, the conversation wrapped up, but the impact of it lingered. Jimmy, the crew, and the audience all knew they had just witnessed something special. The lights came up, the music began to play, and the show moved on. But as the credits rolled and the audience began to file out of the studio, there was an undeniable sense that the night hadn't just been about entertainment. It had been about something deeper, something that would stay with them long after the laughter and applause had faded. As the night carried on, the atmosphere in the studio had shifted once again. The usual hum of excitement that marked the end of a late-night talk show was quieter now, filled with a kind of thoughtful reflection. The conversation with Keanu had left a lasting impression, not just on Jimmy, but on everyone in the audience as well. It wasn't something you could easily shake off. It was the kind of moment that stuck with you, making you think about your own life and your own choices in a way that wasn't easy to ignore. As the applause died down and the crew started wrapping up, Jimmy sat back in his chair, still digesting the conversation. He had interviewed a lot of people over the years, but few had left him feeling like this. Usually, by the time the show ended, he was ready to move on to the next segment. But tonight, he didn't want to let go of the moment. It was as if the conversation with Keanu had cracked open something inside him that he wasn't ready to close just yet. Keanu, on the other hand, seemed as calm as ever. His expression was thoughtful, but he didn't seem to be affected by the weight of the conversation. Perhaps it was because he had been living by these principles for so long that they had become second nature to him. Or maybe it was just who he was. A person who had a way of making even the most profound ideas sound simple and easy to grasp. Keanu, Jimmy said, breaking the silence, I've got to ask. You've obviously learned a lot over the years. About life, about fame, about what really matters. But do you ever have moments when it all feels too much? When the pressure of being in the public eye gets to you? Keanu thought for a moment before responding. I think everyone has those moments, he said quietly. It's natural. It's hard not to feel the weight of things sometimes. But when that happens, I try to remind myself of what I've learned. I remind myself that I can only control what I can control, and that the rest, well, it's not up to me. It's about finding peace in the things I can't change. Jimmy nodded, feeling a deep sense of respect for Keanu's outlook. It wasn't just the calmness in his voice that made his words resonate. It was the authenticity. You could tell that Keanu wasn't just saying things he thought people wanted to hear. He was speaking from a place of real experience, of lessons learned through hardship and growth. That's amazing, Jimmy said after a pause. I think a lot of people, especially in the spotlight, don't have that kind of peace. They're constantly fighting to maintain their image, their success. It can be exhausting, but you make it sound like it's not about holding on so tightly. It's about letting go. Keanu smiled softly. Exactly. It's about not being so attached to outcomes. It's easy to get caught up in the idea that you need to have everything figured out, but life doesn't work like that. It's messy, unpredictable, and sometimes the best thing you can do is just show up and do your best without worrying about what's next. Jimmy laughed lightly, but there was a sincerity in his tone. I don't know if I could ever let go that easily. I'm always thinking about the next big thing, the next joke, the next segment. It's hard to stay in the moment when you're constantly thinking ahead. Keanu's expression was calm, almost compassionate. It's hard, I know, but that's why it's important to find balance, to take moments for yourself. I try to remind myself that I'm not a machine. I'm a person, and as much as I love what I do, I need to take time to step back, breathe, and just be. The audience, who had been listening intently, responded with a soft round of applause. It wasn't the usual loud cheer that came after a joke or funny comment. This was a quieter, more thoughtful kind of applause. It was a moment of recognition, not just of Keanu's words, but of the truth behind them. Jimmy looked around the room, noticing how the usual energy of the show had shifted. There was something different in the air. The usual pace of the show, fast, upbeat, and full of energy, had slowed down. The audience was no longer just waiting for the next laugh. They were reflecting, processing the conversation, perhaps even questioning their own lives. You know, Keanu, Jimmy said after a moment, his tone quieter now. I think you're right. We get so caught up in what's coming next that we forget to just be. I think a lot of people, myself included, could really learn something from that. Keanu gave him a knowing look. It's not easy, but it's worth it. Life doesn't have to be a race. It's okay to slow down sometimes. Jimmy took a deep breath, thinking about how much the conversation had shifted his perspective. It's funny, isn't it? How we spend so much of our lives chasing things we think will make us happy, but often the things we really need are already right in front of us. Keanu nodded, his eyes sincere. Exactly. The happiness you're looking for is often already there, in the people you love, in the moments you share, in the kindness you give. You just have to recognize it. The conversation had become more than just an interview. It had become a reflection on life itself. For Jimmy, this wasn't the usual exchange of stories or jokes. This was a chance to think about what really mattered. He had gone into the interview expecting to talk about movies, about Keanu's latest projects, but instead, he found himself talking about life, about the things that made it meaningful. And in doing so, he had stumbled upon something far more valuable than just another celebrity story. Keanu seemed to sense that the conversation had reached a turning point. He leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but purposeful. You know, Jimmy, it's important to remember that no one has all the answers. We're all just figuring things out. But the more we focus on the things that truly matter, the easier it is to find peace in the chaos. Jimmy sat in silence for a moment, processing the weight of Keanu's words. He had always thought of himself as someone who had his life together, who knew what he was doing. But tonight, in this moment, he realized that he had been so focused on the external, on success, on the show, that he had neglected the more important things. The relationships, the kindness, the moments that couldn't be measured by ratings or applause. I'm really glad we had this conversation, Keanu, Jimmy said, his voice sincere. It's not often that I feel like I'm actually learning something on my own show. Keanu smiled, a simple, quiet smile that reflected the humility he had shown throughout the interview. I'm glad I could share something with you. It's always nice to talk about what really matters. As the interview wrapped up, the energy in the room began to shift again. The music started to play. The crew began to move, and the usual flurry of activity that marked the end of the show returned. But there was still a quiet, lingering sense of gratitude in the air. It was as if everyone in the room had been given a gift, a reminder of the things that truly mattered. As the credits rolled and the audience began to file out of the studio, they carried with them the message that Keanu had shared. It wasn't about fame or success. It was about kindness, humility, and the importance of being present in the moment. For Jimmy, the show had taken on a whole new meaning. It wasn't just about entertaining people. It was about offering them something real, something worth thinking about long after the laughter had faded. The show had been a success, but not in the way anyone had expected. It wasn't the jokes or the laughter that people would remember. It was the conversation itself, one that made everyone, from Jimmy to the audience, reflect on their own lives and what truly mattered. The night had unfolded in a way no one could have predicted. The usual whirlwind of jokes, fast-paced segments, and celebrity banter had taken a back seat to something more meaningful, more intimate. As the final moments of the show approached, Jimmy sat backstage reflecting on what had just happened. The lights had dimmed, the audience had left, and the usual buzz of excitement had quieted down. But the conversation with Keanu Reeves still lingered in the air, like the aftertaste of a strong cup of coffee, intense, sharp, and lingering long after it was finished. For Jimmy, this show had been different. It wasn't just another night of interviews and laughter. It had been a revelation, a quiet wake-up call. When he had invited Keanu to come on the show, he expected to talk about the usual things, the movies, the roles, maybe a few funny stories. But he didn't expect to walk away feeling like his life had changed in some small way. And yet that's exactly what had happened. Keanu had a way of making complex ideas sound simple, of cutting through the noise and reminding everyone that what truly mattered wasn't fame or success, but kindness, presence, and love. As the crew packed up, Jimmy found himself sitting alone in his dressing room for a moment, letting the weight of the conversation settle in. His phone buzzed, a reminder of the many texts, calls, and messages that always came after a show. But tonight he didn't reach for it right away. Instead, he stared at his reflection in the mirror, thinking about what Keanu had said, about slowing down, being present, and focusing on the things that really mattered. It was easy to get caught up in the daily grind, Jimmy realized. The constant chase for ratings, for bigger guests, for the next viral moment. But was that really what mattered? Was that the kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind? He didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear. He wanted to do better. He wanted to be more present in his life, to show up for the people who mattered, and to stop getting so caught up in the noise. Just then, there was a knock on the door. Jimmy turned to see one of the producers peek inside. "Hey Jimmy, just wanted to say great show tonight." The audience loved it. "We'll get the final numbers in a bit, but it felt like something different, you know? You really connected with Keanu." Jimmy smiled, but it wasn't his usual quick grin. It was more of a reflective smile, the kind that came from understanding something deeper. "Yeah, it was different. I didn't expect it to go the way it did, but I'm glad it did. I think we all needed that." The producer raised an eyebrow. "You're telling me?" "We've had tons of guests, but that conversation was something else. People in the audience were really listening. I think we all walked away with a little more than we came in with." Jimmy nodded, still processing. It's funny how sometimes the simplest conversations can have the biggest impact. I mean, Keanu's been through a lot, but he's got this calm about him. He doesn't need to prove anything. And I think that's what makes him so real. The producer grinned. "Yeah, he's definitely not your typical Hollywood star. But maybe that's why people like him so much. He doesn't try to be anything he's not. He's just Keanu." As the producer left, Jimmy sat back in his chair, thinking about the word real. That was what Keanu was. Real. It wasn't about the roles he played on screen or the headlines he made off screen. It was about who he was when the cameras weren't rolling, about how he treated people, how he showed up in his own life. For Jimmy, that was a lesson worth remembering. He'd spent so much time trying to be the funniest, the most entertaining, the biggest personality on TV. But what if in doing that, he had lost sight of the real moments, the ones that didn't need a punchline, that didn't need a clever quip to land? What if instead of chasing after the next big laugh, he started focusing on being present? What if he started showing up for the people who mattered? Not just in the big moments, but in the small ones too. He was snapped out of his thoughts when his assistant poked her head in. "Hey Jimmy, there's someone here to see you." Jimmy raised an eyebrow. "At this hour? Who's stopping by?" The assistant hesitated for a second before responding. "It's Keanu. He wanted to say goodbye before heading out." A smile spread across Jimmy's face. "Of course, send him in." A few moments later, Keanu walked into the room, his calm demeanor unchanged. He seemed almost out of place in the fast-paced world of late-night talk shows, where everyone was always running to the next thing. But there was something grounding about him, something that made the madness feel less important. "Hey Keanu, I didn't expect you to come by," Jimmy said, standing up to shake his hand. "Thanks for taking the time." Keanu smiled, the same humble smile he'd worn throughout the entire interview. "No problem, Jimmy. I just wanted to thank you for the conversation tonight. It's not often I get to talk about these things in a way that feels real. It was nice." Jimmy chuckled, sitting back down. It was definitely real. Honestly, I'm still thinking about what we talked about. I feel like I've got a lot of work to do, you know? I want to focus more on the things that matter. I want to be more present, more kind. Not just for the show, but for the people around me. Keanu nodded, his eyes warm. You're on the right track. Just keep showing up. Keep being there. It doesn't have to be anything big. It's the little things that make the difference. Jimmy leaned forward, feeling a sense of gratitude he hadn't expected. You know, I think a lot of people probably think you've got everything figured out. You're Keanu Reeves, after all. But what you're saying makes me realize that none of us have all the answers. We're all just trying to do our best, right? Keanu's smile was soft, almost knowing. Exactly. No one has it all figured out. But that's the beauty of it. We're all on this journey together. As the two of them spoke, something in the room felt lighter, as if the conversation had lifted a weight from both of them. Keanu didn't need to be a movie star to be a role model. He was already doing the hardest thing of all, living an authentic life no matter the circumstances. Well, Keanu, I don't know how to thank you for tonight. It's not every day that a conversation like this happens, Jimmy said, his voice sincere. Keanu gave him a quick nod. No need to thank me, Jimmy. Just keep doing your thing. But don't forget the people who are with you along the way. As Keanu made his way out the door, Jimmy sat there for a moment longer, reflecting on everything they had discussed. The show was over, the cameras had stopped rolling, but the impact of the night wasn't something that would fade. The lesson Keanu had imparted, that life was about showing up, being present and focusing on what truly mattered, would stay with him for a long time. And for once, Jimmy didn't feel the need to rush to the next thing. He didn't need to fill the silence with noise. He just needed to sit in the moment and let it sink in. As he finally picked up his phone, he realized that the texts and messages could wait. There was something bigger at play now, something that didn't need to be chased, something that was already here,